I followed my wife on a business trip with her boss and caught them kissing at the hotel. I should have felt angry at that moment, but what rose in my throat was a metallic taste, like blood, mixed with an unbearable nausea. I hid behind a column in the hotel lobby as I watched the scene unfold as if it were part of a movie, a slow, intimate, shameless kiss, as if neither of us felt guilty or ashamed. It was as if that kiss had been rehearsed, as if it had been repeated many times before. I was shaking all over, but my fingers were precise as they took my cell phone out of my pocket and captured that image. An image that would become the turning point of my life. I put the phone away, turned my back, and walked to the nearest taxi with a coldness that still scares me to this day. I returned home in silence, a silence that screamed inside. I spent hours staring at the walls of the living room, as if I expected them to give me a better explanation than she could. When she walked through the door, smiling, tired, saying, "Hi, honey, what a nice surprise," I only stared at her for a few seconds. She was still wearing the necklace I had given her for our wedding anniversary. I pointed to the table and said, "And how was the trip?" Before she could answer, I placed the printed photo on the table, face up. The silence between us became dense. She turned pale, her eyes wide, her breathing shallow. Her lips moved as if she were going to say something, but no sound came. There was nothing to say. I simply announced, "We are in the process of divorce as of now." She begged, she cried, she knelt, she spoke of mistakes, of regret, of confusion, of need, of fragility. But all I could hear was the echo of the camera clicking in my pocket and the dry sound of the taxi door slamming as I left that hotel. That was when the pain began to transform into something else. It wasn't just hate. It was hunger for justice. Hunger for balance. I didn't just want to leave. I wanted her to feel what it was like to be betrayed, replaced, forgotten. I wanted her to live with the consequences of the choice she made within the four walls of a hotel room. In the days that followed, while she desperately tried to pick up the pieces of what was left, I gathered my strength in silence. Her lover. Her boss. Married. Father of 2 children. A man who seemed to have everything under control. But I knew that behind that leadership posture was someone who also had weaknesses, vanities, secrets. I used what I knew with surgical precision. I discovered details, previous encounters, schedules crossed with work spreadsheets. And without her knowing, I began a process of separation that would guarantee me more than justice, control. She lost her house. I kept custody of the dog, the room where she painted, and the silence she left behind. But that was just the beginning. What no one expected, and what she could never have imagined, was that the same betrayal that had destroyed our marriage would be the path to my rise. Her lover was also the owner of a growing franchise chain. A respected name in the market, but with shady financial dealings hidden behind the scenes. I approached one of the company's silent partners, an Argentine investor thirsting for revenge for having been cheated out of a fraudulent contract. Together, we devised a strategy. An investment of mine came in as a front, and before she knew it, I was running the Latin American arm of the company that her lover had once arrogantly run. Fate has ingenious ways of showing us the way. Her face, when she saw me speaking at a conference months later, as COO of the company she thought she knew by heart, was the second image I will never forget. She was in the audience, sitting next to him, neither of us knowing that the man on stage, with the gray tie and the steady gaze, was the same man who had been betrayed in a hotel in Buenos Aires. The same man who had said one night in a firm voice, "We are in the process of getting a divorce." And there, on that stage, before applause and spotlights, I knew that my revenge was complete. But it was behind the scenes, when the contracts were signed and the doors closed, that the real blow was struck. The company, now under my management and that of my new partners, underwent restructuring. Her lover was dismissed with a silence clause. And she, now without support, without a position and without a husband, received a curt email informing her of her dismissal. With no right to appeal. No goodbyes. The same silence that accompanied me that early morning on the way home was now all she could hear around her. Still, even after all the twists and turns, there was something I was missing. It wasn't revenge. It was reconstruction. And, as fate seemed to like ironies, it was precisely during a business trip, ironically another one, that I met her. A sweet, firm woman, with a calm voice and a genuine smile. Someone who also knew the scars of betrayal and who had learned, like me, to survive. We started slowly, between coffees and confidences, until what was survival turned into admiration, and then love. A mature love, without haste, without lies. A love of someone who already knows the price of giving themselves to someone. Today, when I look back, I see that scene in the hotel lobby was more than an end. It was the beginning of truth. The breaking point between the man I was and the man who rose from the ashes. And when I think of the image of that photo on the kitchen table, I also think of what it meant. Not just betrayal. But revelation. Choice. Strength. The strangest thing is that to this day she doesn't know how I found out about everything. I never told her. There were never any confrontations, or long conversations. Just silence. Cold. Painful. But necessary. Maybe, one day, she'll find out. Maybe, by some coincidence of fate, she'll hear this story being told by someone. Maybe, she'll wonder how that one night in Buenos Aires was able to rewrite her entire life. And maybe, just maybe, she'll discover that the most painful revenge is not screaming, but silent success. But what she never expected, is that the man she betrayed with contempt would be the same one who, months later, would decide her fate in a boardroom. And the question that won't go away is, was it just a kiss at the hotel? Or was there something much deeper hidden on that business trip? Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of cheating is supported or romanticized. All stories are fiction, but realistically portray how infidelity can destroy lives, homes, and trust. The objective is clear, to show the devastating consequences of lies and disloyalty. Prepare yourself. You are about to hear a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. For years, Daniel believed he had found the rare kind of love that few are lucky enough to experience. He and Helena met when they were young, during a university exchange in Santiago, and since then, they have built not only a life together, but a story full of complicity, affection, and a respect that seemed unshakable. Daniel was methodical, observant, possessed of a subtle sense of humor and an almost uncompromising sense of loyalty. With a degree in engineering, he made a career in a multinational energy company, where he quickly gained prestige for his competence and discretion. Helena, on the other hand, had an expansive energy, was analytical, creative and endowed with an emotional intelligence that made her admired by everyone around her. With a degree in international relations, she had landed an enviable position as a development advisor in a strategic consulting firm. She was known for her ability to navigate high-tension corporate environments with a light smile and precise answers. Their marriage was, in everyone's eyes, exemplary. They had a carefully balanced routine, respected each other's space, celebrated small achievements as if they were big victories, and made a point of maintaining simple traditions they had created since they started dating, like cooking together on Sundays, or riding bikes along the waterfront on Saturday mornings. Among their friends, they were the reference couple, the kind that inspired other couples to try harder, to care more, to stay longer. There was no exaggeration of public displays, but the intimate gestures between the two spoke volumes, a look, a touch, a whispered comment between meetings or in the middle of a party. They had their own language, almost invisible, that only those who knew them closely could decipher. Over time, however, life began to change. Daniel began to take on more and more responsibilities at work, with frequent meetings and trips, and Helena, who had always sought to advance in her career, began to be noticed by her direct boss, who increasingly involved her in international projects. Both were growing professionally, but little by little, this expansion created a subtle but constant distance. Meals together began to become rare, Sundays were filled with accumulated tasks, and the beach became just a plan for, when there was time. Neither of them complained. They were adults, mature, aware that difficult times are part of any solid relationship. But beneath the surface, there was a kind of silent disconnect, like an out-of-tune song that is not yet annoying, but is beginning to become noticeable to attentive ears. Helena was particularly excited about the new challenges at the company. After years of working with local teams, she began to travel frequently to represent the consultancy in negotiations abroad. Buenos Aires became a regular destination, and her involvement in bilateral projects with Argentine companies gave her even greater visibility. Daniel, for his part, felt proud, but also a little uneasy. Not out of jealousy, but out of a feeling that was hard to describe, something like the impression that Helena was finding an enthusiasm that she had not shown at home for some time. But he kept quiet. He preferred to trust, he preferred to believe that this was just part of the natural process of evolution of those who have been together for years. Despite the changes, the conversations between the two still existed. But with a different texture. They were practical, more technical than emotional, often interrupted by urgent messages or exhaustion. Daniel tried, from time to time, to recover the old atmosphere. He would surprise Helena with improvised dinners, or small notes left inside the book she read before going to sleep. Sometimes she would smile, other times she seemed too tired to react. Even so, he continued. He continued because, for him, love was proven mainly through persistence. And if there was one thing it was persistent. Helena, on the other hand, was beginning to deal with an avalanche of new sensations. She felt recognized, admired for her intelligence, valued in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't that Daniel didn't value her, he loved her with a silent depth. But there was a new kind of admiration emerging around her, something that messed with her self-esteem in an unexpected way. She wasn't the type to seek approval, but she wasn't immune to the enchantment of being seen as someone indispensable, desired, important. And although she still had affection and respect for Daniel, she began to keep small moments of doubt to herself. She wasn't unhappy with him. She just felt numb. The house where they lived, in a quiet, leafy neighborhood, was spacious and comfortable. They had built everything with great care, from the furniture they had chosen at design fairs to the paintings they had bought on their travels, which told a little about their journey together. There was history there. But over time, each object began to seem like a reminder of the past, not the present. The sofa where they had watched TV series on Sundays was now occupied more by absences than by presences. Their room remained the same blue bedspread, the same warm lampshade, the same woody scent of Daniel's perfume. But there was something suspended in the air, as if the room had become the setting for an interrupted dialogue, a story on pause. Despite this, there was no conflict. Helena and Daniel did not fight. There were no heated arguments, no shouting, no slamming doors. There was silence. A polite, educated silence, full of mechanical pleasantries. Good morning with a kiss on the forehead. Good night with the blanket pulled up to the shoulders. The kind of silence that does not denounce a war, but that does not celebrate peace either. A space where time passes slowly, and where each daily gesture is gradually emptied of meaning. One night, after another long day, Daniel tried to start a more intimate conversation. He talked about how much he missed her, asked if they could still see each other like before. Helena carefully deflected, said that the problem was too many commitments, that everything would return to normal when the project in Buenos Aires was finished. Daniel nodded, without insisting. He believed in the strength of the bond between them, he believed that lasting relationships had cycles, that it was just a moment. I saw no signs of disloyalty, nor did I have any reason to be suspicious. I just missed it. At a glance. From one sentence. From a spontaneous gesture. To be remembered not as the husband, but as the man. Helena, in turn, began to spend more time outside. Travel has increased, as have after-hours commitments. She justified it naturally, always with clear, convincing arguments. Daniel listened attentively, offered support, wished good luck, and said goodbye with long kisses, believing that everything was part of a joint effort for a better future. He still looked at her in admiration. Deep down, she wondered what to do with the diffuse guilt that was beginning to accumulate deep in her chest, even without having done, yet, anything that could be considered a betrayal. Their circle of friends also began to notice the change in the couple. Subtle questions would come up during get-togethers. "Are you okay? You've been traveling a lot, huh? Daniel stayed home again." They were always asked with smiles, but with that curious tone that betrays an unspoken suspicion. Helena would laugh and change the subject. Daniel, when asked, would answer calmly. He truly believed they were okay. They were just busy. Tired. But okay. Over time, loneliness became a permanent guest in Daniel's routine. He would come home from work, heat up his own food, put the plate in the sink, and sit on the couch with the remote control in his hand, staring at the screen without seeing. The room, which had once been a refuge, became a strange, almost impersonal space. Still, he didn't give up. He waited for Fridays with the hope that she would come back early. That a bottle of wine would be opened. That a movie would be watched under the same blanket. Sometimes it happened. And he clung to those moments as if they were irrefutable proof that love still lived there. But deep down, something was changing. A silent, delicate and, at the same time, devastating transformation. Like when you realize that a song you loved no longer touches you in the same way. Or when you return to a beloved place and everything seems smaller, colder, stranger. Nothing was wrong in words or actions. But everything was different. And it was in this scenario of absence disguised as presence, of promises in low tones, of silences too long to be comfortable, that the story began to truly take shape. A story that had not yet revealed its secrets, but that already whispered that something was coming. Something that would transform not only Daniel and Helena's days, but also the way they would look at themselves. Now that you know the beginning, get ready to discover what's hidden beneath the veneer of a seemingly perfect relationship. Because some betrayals don't start with kisses. They start with absences. With emptiness. And with silences that no one dares to interrupt. The distance that was previously shown in small gestures began to solidify into definitive gestures. Helena's trips increased, her returns became more spaced out, her messages were read without a response, and her phone calls were postponed with the excuse of urgent meetings. Daniel, who always believed in the balance built between them, found himself increasingly on the fringes of a life he could no longer achieve. His eyes sought hers at each reunion, but there was a constant distraction, a haste disguised as fatigue, a delicate evasion that told her more than any explanation. The body was still present, but her soul seemed to be in another time zone, another room, perhaps another universe. Yet he kept his faith quiet, not out of naivety, but out of love. I believed that the phase would pass, that everything would get back on track. Helena, in turn, was immersed in a new rhythm, involved in increasingly complex projects alongside Caio, the executive director of the Argentine branch. A charismatic, perceptive and absolutely self-assured man, he knew how to make himself present with precise words, with accurate compliments, with subtle gestures that made her feel relevant in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. There was no rush between them, there was no pressure. The game was subtle, almost invisible to the eyes of any outside observer. It started with longer glances, with accidental touches in meetings, with invitations to dinners where, at first, everything was professional. But Helena wasn't naive. She knew where this could lead. She knew what was hidden between the lines of a repeated compliment, in the way he leaned across the table when talking to her, in the way he made her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in a long time. Daniel slowly began to feel something slipping through his fingers. It wasn't concrete proof, it was a restlessness that took root in the smallest details. A different perfume on the clothes she was wearing when she arrived from her trip, a forced smile when answering simple questions, the lack of enthusiasm when he talked about their future. He began to notice flight times, phone calls, names mentioned too often. He didn't want to believe it, but the pieces began to fit together with an uncomfortable perfection. And when the heart begins to suspect, everything around becomes a sign. A very packed suitcase, a photo posted with a generic location, a sudden silence after a message was sent. One weekend, Helena had to travel again. She said she had an urgent project. Daniel nodded, wished her luck, and offered her a ride to the airport. She declined, saying she had already made arrangements with the team. Daniel smiled and wished her a safe trip, but something inside him was starting to break into silent pieces. That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed on the porch, staring at the empty backyard as if he could find answers there. The dawn seemed longer, colder, crueler. Something inside him whispered that this trip was different. The way she got ready, the sparkle in her eyes, the slight tremor as she said goodbye. It wasn't work anxiety. It was something else. Something he didn't want to name yet. On Monday, he called the company and told them he was taking the week off. He said he needed to rest and sort out some personal matters. He got in his car and drove aimlessly for hours until he decided what he was going to do. And then, without warning, he caught a flight in the late afternoon. He knew the name of the hotel, he knew the days of the trip. That was all he needed. When he arrived, he discreetly checked into a nearby hotel, with a direct view of the building where Helena had said she was staying. It was an elegant place, frequented by executives and high-ranking officials. He knew it was risky, that he could be wrong, but he could no longer suppress his doubts. He needed to see for himself. The next morning, he began to observe the activity calmly, with the patience of someone waiting for the truth. And on the second day, he saw it. Helena left the hotel with Kaio, smiling, her hair tied up in a different way, wearing a dress he had never seen before. They stopped next to the car, talked for a few minutes and then kissed. A full kiss, without rushing, without fear. A kiss from someone who no longer hides. Daniel felt his heart lose its rhythm. What until then had been a suspicion became a fact. The image stuck like a splinter under his skin. He felt the world crumble around him, but his body remained still. He waited for them to get in the car, took his cell phone out of his pocket and took the photo. He needed to take a picture. Not to prove it to anyone. But to himself. So that he wouldn't doubt after what he had seen. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just went down to the street, called a taxi and left without looking back. The flight back was silent. She didn't sleep. She didn't read. She just stared into space while something inside her died silently. When she got home, she took a shower, put on the most neutral clothes she had, and sat at the table in the living room, with the photo printed on the glass top. Hours later, Helena came through the door, taking off her shoes and smiling as if nothing had happened. She talked about the flight, the weather, the meeting. Daniel waited. When she approached to kiss him, he pointed to the table. She looked. The smile disappeared in seconds. Her hand trembled. Her eyes widened. Helena tried to speak, but there were no words. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply announced, in a low, firm voice, that there was no way forward for the two of them. He said that their marriage was over. That there would be no scene. No second chance. The pain, contained, was fiercer than any attack. She tried to justify it. She spoke of loneliness. Of confusion. Of tiredness. But each word was like vinegar on the wound. Daniel didn't want explanations. He wanted distance. And silence. And so, with the same elegance with which they had built their relationship, he broke the bond. Without scandal. But with a surgical precision that only those deeply wounded are capable of achieving. The days that followed were gray. The house fell silent. She left with just a few bags, taking clothes, documents and a little of the dignity she still had left. Daniel got what was left. The walls, the furniture, her smell in some rooms, and an absence that made noise. But there was something different about him now. A force that rose with each dawn. A clarity that only absolute suffering can offer. The betrayal had been like an explosion, devastating, but revealing. It showed the cracks that were previously hidden beneath the veneer of routine. And now, amidst the rubble, he began to glimpse a new path. A path that would not only be full of pain, but of revelations. Because, even though he thought he had already figured it all out, the most destructive truth was yet to come. The divorce was finalized in just over 2 months. There were no legal battles, no disputes over assets, no children to share custody of. Daniel wanted nothing more than his freedom. He didn't want any of Helena's savings, he didn't contest anything about her assets, he just made it clear that that chapter of his life was over. She tried to talk to him other times, but he maintained the cutting coldness of someone who no longer recognizes the face he once loved. His silence was her punishment. A silence that said more than 1,000 accusations. Helena began living in a small rented apartment near the company, while she tried to put together the pieces of a life that had fallen apart without warning. At work, the looks on her face changed. The affair with Kaio, although never officially admitted, became a rumor that went through walls, and the admiration she once received turned into a kind of embarrassment disguised as cordiality. The euphoria she felt with him turned into discomfort, because the enchantment dissipated and all that was left was reality, a hidden, fragile relationship, based on lies and fueled by stolen moments. Kaio, in turn, began to slowly distance himself. First, he claimed to be overworked, then he had unavoidable commitments, until his messages became sparse and his presence almost non-existent. Helena still tried to force him to meet up, but he responded evasively and coldly. One day, she confronted him. He said he had never promised anything, that everything was consensual, that he had gotten involved, but that he could not compromise his image for something that should have ended before it began. It was like being pushed off a building that was already in ruins. Meanwhile, Daniel remained silent. He didn't say anything to his friends. When they asked, he would just say he was fine. He went back to running along the shore, and reading in the cafes where he used to go with Helena, but now alone. And it was there, on one of those ordinary mornings, that the story took a new turn. He met Laura by chance, sharing a table due to lack of space. She was a literature teacher, new to the city, and in love with Clarice Lispector and dry wines. She had a light way of speaking and a shy laugh that sounded like a breeze after a storm. What started with a coffee turned into a long conversation, then another, and another. Daniel wasn't looking for anything, but he found something he didn't know he needed. Laura didn't ask questions about his past. She respected him. And little by little, he began to feel like talking. Not to justify himself, but to share. And it was in that safe space that he began to rebuild himself. Helena found out about the relationship through a mutual friend. She laughed disdainfully, then fell silent. But days later, she dreamed about him. She woke up with a weight on her chest that she couldn't explain. She tried to ignore it. She couldn't. Life went on for months until an unexpected invitation arrived in Daniel's inbox. A business event for market expansion, promoted by an international group that had acquired part of the consulting firm where Kaio worked as a director. Daniel's name had been suggested by an Argentine investor with whom he had started contacting after his divorce. It seemed like just a business opportunity, but what he didn't expect was that this event would be the stage where the final secret would be revealed. The room was luxurious, the lighting was carefully adjusted, and the most influential names in the sector circulated between glasses of champagne and strategic smiles. Daniel remained discreet until the moment he was called to the stage to announce the merger of his new company with the Argentine consultancy. There was one detail that had not been announced until then: Daniel was now part of the board of directors of the group that controlled the sector where Kaio worked. And the most delicate decision of the night was yet to be made. Helena was there. At Kaio's invitation, he wanted to show the new board a solid team. When Daniel's name was announced and he went up on stage, her face froze. She couldn't understand what was happening. There, with a calm demeanor, talking about strategic vision, sustainability, and innovation. She looked around, as if to confirm that it wasn't a delusion. Daniel ended his speech with a sentence that silenced the room. Sometimes, the most tortuous paths lead us to the most precise destinations. And no pain is in vain when it pushes us to where we should have been from the beginning. After the speech, while the guests were dispersing, Daniel approached Kaio with the elegance he always had. He greeted him with a firm handshake and a neutral expression. Kaio tried to hide his tension. He asked about the company, complimented the acquisition, and Daniel just nodded. Until he said, with a slight smile, "Life takes turns, doesn't it? It's so interesting to meet you again here, but even more interesting is knowing where certain invitations come from, right?" Kaio just smiled, uncomfortably. The next morning, the impact of the meeting was spreading among the directors. Rumors of internal changes began to circulate. And that was when the secret emerged from the shadows. Helena received a call from the legal department. They asked her to come to the meeting room to clarify previous travel records. When she arrived, she was surprised by a meeting with 3 members of the board, including Daniel. There was a folder on the table. A dossier. She tried to maintain her composure, but when she saw the contents, she felt the air leave her lungs. The documents detailed transfers made by the financial sector authorized by Kaio in her name, linking her CPF to fraudulent invoices that had gone unnoticed in the accounting system. Kaio had used her name as a front in a scheme to overcharge contracts signed during trips abroad. The affair, which she thought was just an emotional escape, was part of something much bigger. She had been involved in a scheme without knowing it, and now her signature was on every document. Daniel, sitting in front of her, remained silent while one of the lawyers explained the legal implications. She tried to defend herself, claiming ignorance, claiming misplaced trust, but the records were clear. The internal investigation was already underway and the group would recommend her immediate dismissal until the investigation was concluded. It was at that moment that she looked at Daniel with eyes filled with despair. And finally, he spoke. In a calm but firm voice. He said that he had never wanted that for her, but that he could not interfere. That there were limits. And that trusting someone did not mean giving up one's conscience. Helena collapsed. Her hands were shaking. Tears began to fall uncontrollably. She understood then that she had lost more than a husband, more than a position. She had lost the only bridge that could perhaps still save her. Outside, the sun shone on the building's mirrored facade, reflecting a world where, behind appearances, truths finally found light. And among all those truths, one became undeniable: the betrayed, humiliated and discarded man was the same one who, in silence, rewrote his destiny and determined hers. And there was still one detail left. A final piece of that puzzle that only he knew where to fit. 2 days after the meeting that destroyed Helena's last shred of professional stability, she walked the company's corridors like a shadow. She hadn't been officially fired, but she had been placed on leave with express instructions not to have contact with any team or project. Her access had been suspended, and even her badge, which she used as an extension of herself, had been deactivated. She left through a side door, avoiding the eyes that whispered questions to which she had no answers. She knew that distorted versions of the facts were already circulating, speculations fueled by the lack of explanations. And, more than ever, she felt that she had been dismantled piece by piece, as a professional, as a woman, as a human being. The trust, the prestige, the control she had always had over her own narrative, everything was now beyond her reach. And no matter how much she tried to rationalize, no matter how much she told herself that she didn't know about the fraud, one insistent question hammered at her mind: at what point did she lose control of her own life? Helena left the city. He went to a distant aunt's house in a smaller town, seeking refuge. He isolated himself from the digital world, silenced social media, and no longer answered unknown numbers. I spent my days staring out the window, trying to understand where everything had started to fall apart. It was as if I was reconstructing a crime and, at the same time, I was the victim and the accomplice. Daniel, on the other hand, returned to his new rhythm of life. The episode of Helena's exposure affected him, yes, but in a way he couldn't name. There was no pleasure in it. No sense of triumph. I felt only one inevitable conclusion. He did what needed to be done, protected what he was building, and was fair with the facts. Now, I wanted distance. He focused on expanding the company, his routine with Laura, and the small, simple pleasures that began to make sense again. He still bore scars, but there was no longer an open wound. However, something still bothered him. A part of the puzzle that, even after everything, still seemed incomplete. It was on a Friday night, when he returned home after a business trip, that he found a letter left under the door of his apartment. The paper was carefully folded, with no sender, but with handwriting that he would recognize even with his eyes closed. There, for the first time, he read words he had not expected. Not an apology, but a confession of sorts. Helena recounted, in detail, what she had discovered after being dismissed. Caio, in fact, had already been under investigation before he even began his relationship with her. And the invitations, the trips, the compliments, it was all part of a plan to use her as a shield. She had been watched, chosen. Her proximity to the board of directors, her strategic position in the sector, her reputation for reliability and precision, all of this made her the ideal victim. And, by all indications, Caio knew that Daniel was her ex-husband. That was exactly what made her the perfect target, someone with connections, but emotionally vulnerable. The letter ended with a strangely serene sentence: "I was an accomplice in my own mistake. Not out of bad faith, but out of pride. Now I know what it means to lose oneself." Daniel finished reading with heavy breathing. The words hit him like a hammer. That revelation gave new meaning to the last few months. She hadn't just betrayed him, she had been betrayed within the betrayal itself. This hit him in a way he hadn't expected. Not because he felt sorry, but because he understood the weight of carrying around bad choices, even when they weren't born out of a desire to hurt. Helena wasn't asking for redemption. She was ending a cycle. And that, in some way, freed him too. Still, there was something else that needed to be resolved. He put the letter away in a drawer and called a contact in the group's legal department. He needed to confirm the facts, to find out how much Helena's truth coincided with the internal reports. The answer came in 2 days: yes, Caio was being investigated before the merger. And yes, his approach to Helena was noted by the risk analysts as something too timely. But, at that moment, nothing could be done, because the direct evidence against him was still weak. The pieces fell into place in a cruel way. Daniel realized that the story, which he believed was already over, still had more to tell. He then decided to do something he hadn't done since the beginning of this whole turnaround: look for her. He drove to the city where she was staying, without warning. When he arrived, she was sitting on the porch of her aunt's house, reading a book with the cover turned upside down. When she saw him, she didn't seem surprised. She just looked up, put down the bookmark, and gestured for him to sit down. They remained silent for a few seconds, the sound of birds in the distance and the creaking of the rocking chair filling the void. He began by saying that he had read the letter. She nodded. There was nothing more to be said about that. Then, he asked what exactly she knew about Caio. Helena took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a few seconds, and told him what she had discovered behind the scenes after the scandal. Caio was involved with a shell company that issued fake invoices in the name of employees of the consultancy to cover up overpriced contracts. She was only used because she had a clean record and was close enough to the financial department to facilitate authorizations. The scam was planned with precision. When the scandal broke, Caio had already moved part of the funds to offshore accounts. The last she heard was that he had taken leave, for health reasons. Daniel listened in silence. Hands resting on knees, gaze fixed on the wooden floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, without bitterness. He said that now everything made more sense. That the pain he felt, though still vivid, was beginning to be replaced by something else, understanding. And that, even so, didn't change what had happened between them. Helena agreed. He said that what they destroyed together would never exist again. But she needed him to know that, despite everything, Kyle manipulated her like so many others. And if at any point Daniel thought she had acted coldly, he was wrong. He replied that he never believed she was evil. But it was lost. And so does he. They said a few more random things, words that only served to clear the space between them. When they said goodbye, there were no promises, no new beginnings. Just a clear look, like two survivors of a tragedy they didn't choose, but faced. Back in the city, Daniel gave Helena's letter to the lawyers as part of the investigation process. Not to incriminate her, but to expose the loopholes used by Kyle. From there, the group contacted the appropriate agencies and filed formal complaints. A month later, the news was confirmed. Kyle had been located in Europe and arrested on charges of corporate fraud and money laundering. It was the end of the line. And with that, a new silence was established, but this time, a silence of closure. Daniel and Laura stayed together. Their relationship grew stronger over time, built on foundations that he now recognized as essential: listening, presence, and truth. Helena returned to teaching corporate ethics at a university, rebuilding her image from the most difficult place, that of her experience with mistakes. They never spoke again, but they knew about each other. And they knew that, no matter how cruel life had been, each step they took led them to the only place where they could find each other: lucidity. Because sometimes, the true climax is not in the pain that breaks us, but in the moment we understand that it was necessary to free us. And then, only then, are we able to move on. Not as we were, but as we should have been from the beginning. Daniel's return to his routine after the investigations were concluded was not marked by euphoria or relief, but by a rare kind of serenity, the kind that comes when there are no more masks to wear or battles to fight. He resumed his commitments to the company without the previous rush, looked at reports with a different focus, and now led meetings with a type of presence that his colleagues began to respect even more. His speech was more restrained, his analysis more precise, and each decision he made carried a maturity that only the abysses of life could provide. The experience, even though it was tough, had transformed him into a man more aware of his own power and the responsibility it entailed. But there was something that haunted him in the silence of the days, an ethical question that, although it did not disturb him in an accusatory way, arose when he allowed himself to remember. To what extent was Helena's downfall, in some way, influenced by the impassive posture he adopted? Not from a legal point of view, but from a human one. Had he, at some point, distanced himself so much that he stopped recognizing in her a reflection of himself, a part of the story that was also his? This restlessness grew stronger in the early hours of the morning when Laura slept beside him and he, motionless, stared at the ceiling, his thoughts passing through like slow ghosts. There was no guilt, but there was a residue of melancholy for everything that had been and would never be again. Sometimes, he imagined what it would be like to meet Helena again in another circumstance, not as someone revisiting wounds, but as someone who recognizes, from afar, a soul that once lived in the same house. He didn't miss her exactly, but rather who he was with her at the beginning of everything, when he still believed that the truth was enough to keep love alive. And understanding that it wasn't enough was one of the bitterest lessons that life imposed on him. Meanwhile, Helena struggled to rebuild her identity away from the references that had once defined her. The classes she taught to small groups didn't pay as much as her previous position, but they brought her something she hadn't felt for a long time: meaning. Talking about corporate ethics, about responsibility, about the limits between ambition and integrity, became a kind of silent redemption. She knew that many looked at her with suspicion, knew about her past and judged her for it, but she no longer tried to convince anyone. Her voice in class was firm, without hiding, and for that reason some students began to respect her precisely because of the vulnerability she no longer hid. For the first time, Helena no longer sought to prove that she was perfect. She just wanted to be someone better. And in this new version of herself, she also needed to learn to live with the weight of choices that had been made between the desire to be loved and the fear of becoming invisible. She now understood that betrayal began long before the act was consummated, that it was born in the neglect of what was essential, in the omission of feelings, in the silence of what should have been said. The two were on different paths, but an invisible connection still connected them, like a thread that never breaks, only stretches to the point of almost disappearing. And this thread became tense again months later, when Daniel received unexpected news. The legal department decided to file a formal lawsuit against everyone involved in the scheme, and despite the evidence exonerating Helena from active participation, her name appeared in the documents as part of the lawsuit. A statement was needed to confirm her status as a victim in the scheme, something that depended directly on Daniel's willingness to declare what he knew about the relationship between her and Caio. He could remain neutral, claim ignorance, and let justice take its course. Or he could intervene, tell the truth that only he knew, which would substantially change the course of the case. It was the first time since the beginning of everything that he found himself faced with a real choice that would directly impact her fate. He spent days reflecting, without telling anyone. Not even Laura. This was a dilemma that concerned only what was left between him and Helena, and even though he was in a different moment, with another woman, in another life, the past could not be erased by changing calendars. He called the lawyer in charge and asked to speak in person. They went to a secluded room, away from the hustle and bustle of the departments. Daniel explained that he did not want to jeopardize the progress of the investigation, but he needed to understand whether his participation would be decisive. The lawyer, a methodical man, answered clearly, yes, if he declared what he knew about Caio's emotional manipulation and about Helena's conduct as being unrelated to the schemes, there would be a chance of reclassifying her as a witness instead of an accomplice. What's more, Daniel's silence could be interpreted as consent or omission, even though he was not legally responsible. He left the room without giving an immediate response. He walked to the parking lot, got into his car, but didn't start the engine. He stayed there for almost an hour, his fingers trembling on the steering wheel. His mind revisiting every scene, every choice, every look that preceded the collapse. Finally, he picked up his cell phone and wrote a short message to Helena, "I need to talk to you. It's important." She replied a few minutes later with an "okay." When and where? They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, off the usual route. When they met, time seemed to go back and forward at the same time. She was different. Her hair was shorter, her face lighter. But her gaze still had that silent density of someone who saw what no one should see of themselves. Daniel was direct. He explained the situation. He said he could testify on her behalf, that he knew she had not been a knowing accomplice, that she had been used. But he also said that it was not easy. That by doing so, he would once again touch on pains that he preferred to keep sealed. She listened attentively, without interrupting. When he finished, she simply asked, "And why are you telling me this now?" Daniel answered with rare honesty, "Because I don't want to carry this with me." Not as silence. Not as guilt. Helena lowered her eyes and bit her lower lip. When she spoke, it was with a serenity that he had not expected. "You owe me nothing. I do not expect your defense. But if you do, I will understand it as an act of justice, not forgiveness." He nodded. And in that gesture there was something deeper than any reconciliation. In the following days, Daniel prepared his statement and delivered it to the legal team. It was a detailed, direct, and straightforward account. In it, he confirmed Caio's manipulation, described the type of relationship they had, and pointed out evidence that Helena was unaware of the misuse of her name. From that point on, the case changed course. Helena was removed from the passive role and became a key witness. It did not free her from the stigma or erase the mistakes she had made, but it did remove her from the center of the legal hurricane. For her, it was a definitive gesture. Something that symbolized the end of a cycle, not with fanfare, but with dignity. For Daniel, the decision brought peace. Not the euphoria of a winner, but the stillness of someone who chooses what is right, even if he has no obligation to do so. He returned to his days with Laura, with the silent routine that he now truly fulfilled. But he knew, deep down, that he had crossed a difficult field of the soul, one where justice mixes with pride, and where forgiving is not forgetting, but accepting that certain battles do not require trophies. Now, the story was coming to an end. And he knew that this end would not be the closing of a wound. It would be the birth of another way of being. A version of himself that, although marked by pain he would never choose, was also made of choices he was proud to have made. Because in the end, what defines a person is not what they suffer, but what they do with what they suffered. And he had done what he thought was right. Without needing to look back. Daniel's decision to testify on Helena's behalf changed not only the course of the legal process, but also the silent streams of his own consciousness. For the first time in a long time, he was acting not out of emotional urgency, but out of a sense of responsibility that came from a deeper, more mature place. There was no regret. He knew he could not erase anyone's mistakes, nor could he save Helena from the weight of her choices, but he could recognize the truth when it emerged clearly, even if belatedly. And this clarity led him to take a step that, although subtle, would become decisive in how he would end this story, the choice not to hold a grudge. As the process progressed, Helena regained her autonomy. She began to participate in academic panels, was invited to collaborate in research on corporate compliance and, little by little, regained not her prestige, which no longer mattered to her, but her self-confidence. The vulnerability he had previously hidden became his greatest strength. It was common to see her in front of audiences made up of students and professionals, saying bluntly that she was betrayed by someone she trusted and that, out of pride, she was slow to admit that she had also lost her way. I no longer wore masks. There was a kind of raw beauty in the way he spoke, as if each word cleansed another dark corner of the soul. Daniel, even from a distance, knew about these events. He didn't often seek out information, but news circulated, and he listened with a kind of mature acceptance. He knew that, although they would never share a life again, Helena was still walking in the same direction as him, forward, away from that which destroyed them. At the same time, his relationship with Laura was entering a more solid phase. The two had built something discreet but deeply intimate. There were no unnecessary demands or idealizations. Just a tacit agreement of respect and presence. Laura was sensitive to Daniel's past, but she never made it the main topic. And he, in turn, learned to separate memory from nostalgia. He knew that loving again did not require forgetting what came before, but rather giving new meaning to what remained. One night, during a conversation by the fireside, Laura asked him how he felt now that everything had been resolved. Daniel took a long time to answer. After a long silence, he simply said, "I feel clean. Not light. Not happy. But clean." Laura said nothing, just held his hand firmly. And in that stillness, something was consolidated, the certainty that there was room to start over with truth, without hiding the scars. Behind the scenes at the company, Daniel's name was now respected not only for his talent, but for the integrity he demonstrated at one of the organization's most sensitive moments. He refused interviews, refused tributes, refused any public exploration of the story. He said that his merit was not in having won, but in not having lost himself in the process. He was promoted to a strategic international role and began traveling frequently, leading initiatives on several fronts. On one of these trips, during a conference in Lisbon, he received an envelope when he arrived at the hotel. There was no sender, just his name written in delicate handwriting. Inside, a single sheet with 3 handwritten sentences, "What you did for me freed me. It still hurts, but today I can breathe. Thank you." There was no signature, but he recognized it immediately. He smiled, put the paper in his diary, closed his eyes and let time pass. That same week, Daniel was walking through an old neighborhood in the city, looking at the facades of historic buildings, when he came across a small, charming bookstore. He entered without rushing, strolling through the narrow aisles, feeling the smell of paper and the weight of the comfortable silence that the place offered. On one of the shelves, he saw a book of poetry with a dedication from Helena. It was a used copy, from a reader who knew her or had attended one of her lectures. And there, in the midst of chance, he understood something even more profound, that stories go on even when we stop telling them, and that our version is never the only one circulating around the world. He picked up the book, bought it without thinking, and walked back to the hotel with unexpected lightness. It was already autumn when Daniel returned to the city. The streets were covered in dry leaves and the wind brought a gentle chill, the kind that gives you goosebumps more because of the memories it carries than because of the temperature itself. Laura was waiting for him at home with a simple dinner and a glass of red wine. They talked about their travels, about a new social project she wanted to support, and then sat on the sofa listening to old music. Suddenly, amidst the soft melody that filled the room, Daniel picked up the book of poetry he had bought in Lisbon, opened it to the dedication and read it quietly. Laura listened in silence. When he finished, she simply said, "It's beautiful. It has pain, but it also has forgiveness." Daniel nodded in agreement. That was it. What he had done was not out of love, nor out of longing, but out of justice. And justice, when practiced with truth, is one of the most powerful forms of forgiveness. Meanwhile, Helena received an invitation to write an article for an international magazine about ethics and vulnerability in the corporate environment. He began to write hesitantly, but soon the words flowed. It was no longer about the scandal, nor about the romance that exposed her. It was about what came next. About how to remain honest even after making mistakes. On how not to hide from pain. At the end of the text, she wrote something that seemed like a letter to herself, but that perhaps, on some level, was also for Daniel. Sometimes, the only way to get up is to accept that there was a moment when we fell with all our strength. And even then, we didn't die. We continued. And it is in this continuing that what we truly have left lies. The days went by. Their lives grew apart, as was natural. But something had changed. There was a kind of peace between them. It wasn't closeness, nor friendship. It was the silent understanding that they had both survived something that could have completely destroyed them. And that, through different paths, they had done something with that pain. They had transformed. And they had moved on. Because in the end, perhaps the hardest thing is not to forgive the other person, but to find a dignified way to forgive oneself. And that autumn, between written pages and respected silences, between chance encounters and memories that no longer hurt, they finally managed it. Last spring, almost 2 years after it all began, Daniel received an offer to sit on the board of an international foundation focused on corporate integrity. The invitation came after the positive repercussion of his work in combating internal fraud and the ethical stance with which he conducted sensitive decisions, including those involving personal conflicts. The position would require important changes, a permanent move to Europe, a new environment, new partners, new responsibilities. When he received the official email with the details, he stared at his laptop screen for several minutes in silence. There was a destiny he could never have foreseen when he believed he would live a quiet and ordinary life with a woman he loved. There was the consolidation of a version of himself that was born from the ashes, that bled and then rose again. And when he accepted the offer, Daniel did not celebrate with parties or dinners. He simply walked to the balcony, opened a bottle of wine and contemplated the cloudy sky, as if he knew that time takes away almost everything, except the truth we carry inside. The trip took place at the beginning of the summer. Laura accompanied him with ease. She knew that she was not taking the place of a replacement, but of a conscious choice. She knew about the ghosts and the abysses he had faced. And so she accompanied him not as someone trying to fill the void of a past, but as someone building a new present from clean rubble. The apartment they started living in was smaller, modest, with simple furniture and large windows. Laura set up her writing studio in the guest room and he set up a small office overlooking a quiet square. The mornings were slow, full of coffee and the exchange of ideas. And little by little, without rushing, they transformed that life into something beautiful. A life without urgencies, without suspicions, without painful silences. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't miss anything at all. Not the pain, nor the past, nor everything he had believed, for years, was essential to being happy. On the other side of the ocean, Helena was putting the finishing touches on her book, now about to be published by a prestigious publisher. The title was straightforward, After the Abyss. It wasn't an autobiography, but the narrative was inspired by her experiences and the behind-the-scenes experiences of the corporate world that almost no one knew about, with its subtle plots, silent disputes, and games of emotional manipulation. She wrote with the clarity of someone who is no longer afraid of being misunderstood. The preface was written by a renowned ethics professor who had been following her recently and recognized her as one of the most lucid voices of today. Helena was no longer trying to prove herself. She no longer needed to. She had accepted that the consequences of her actions would come at a high price, but that, even so, that didn't stop her from building something new. The book was well received by critics. She participated in fairs, lectures, and interviews. And in each of them, he spoke bluntly about how he lost almost everything because of a mistake that didn't start in a hotel bed, but on the day he began to silence his own truth. He said that betrayals don't come from impulses, but from constant abandonment, including self-abandonment. One morning, after finishing a radio interview, she received a message on her cell phone. It was from her aunt, informing her that her father's health had taken a turn for the worse. Helena had cut ties with her family for years, after old fights and conflicts that had never been resolved. But at that moment, something made her pack her bags and catch the first flight. She found her father in the hospital, frail but lucid. The two talked for hours. He apologized for things he had said in the past, for not having supported her at crucial moments, and she, with tears held back, simply replied, "I failed you too." They didn't need more. They hugged each other tightly, and for the first time since she was a teenager, she felt that they belonged together again, not as an idealized father and daughter, but as two imperfect humans trying to forgive each other. A few days later, walking through the city center, Helena saw a small bookstore with posters announcing the launch of her book. She stopped in front of the window and noticed her own name on the cover, reflected in the glass, mixed with the image of herself outside. For a second, she felt an unexpected emptiness, as if that moment of achievement was also a regret for what could have been. But when she entered the store, she was surprised by a young woman holding the book in her hands. "Are you the author?" she asked with a sparkle in her eyes. Helena nodded with a smile. The young woman said that the book had changed her perception of the corporate world and that now she thought twice before keeping quiet when she noticed something wrong. That was it. That was where redemption lay, not in clearing her name, but in inspiring others not to get lost like she had. She thanked her, signed the copy, and left in peace. As for Caio, he faced the legal process in silence. He was in preventive detention and awaiting trial, and refused interviews and remained silent in the face of the accusations. His lawyers tried to reduce his sentence, but the amount of evidence left little room for maneuvers. The few colleagues who still communicated with him reported that he spent his days in seclusion, with a bitter and unstable expression. His arrogance had given way to a silent rage, as if he could not accept having lost control of a game he always thought he dominated. At the end of the trial, he was convicted of corporate fraud, money laundering, and abuse of power. He would serve his sentence and lose the right to act as an executive for years. He was seen by some in prison, isolated, drawing with a ballpoint pen on pieces of paper, shapeless scribbles, as if trying to redesign a life that no longer exists. Daniel learned of the conviction months later, during a conference in Brussels. He was at a formal dinner when someone mentioned Caio's name and commented on the final verdict. He just nodded, showing no interest. When he got back to his hotel room that night, he called Laura. She answered in a sleepy voice and he simply said, "Everything is exactly where it should be." She replied with an, "I know," and they sat there in silence, as they always did when no words were needed anymore. Time went on. Daniel and Laura decided to get married discreetly, in an intimate ceremony in the garden of the house where they lived. They invited a few friends, no ostentation, no rehearsed speeches. Just vows exchanged under the soft light of a serene afternoon, with promises that came from two hearts that knew what it was like to have been broken. Helena didn't know about the wedding, but perhaps she had an inkling. She was busy with the second edition of the book, now translated into 3 languages. In a live interview, she was asked if she still believed in love. She laughed, took a deep breath and replied, "I believe in the love that is born after the end. Not the kind that fills the void, but the kind that respects the space that the pain left." And so, each of the characters found their place. Not the perfect place, not the idealized ending, but the place consistent with the choices they made. Daniel, far from where it all began, lived in peace with what he built. Helena, reconstructed, transformed her pain into words. Laura, silent and firm, continued as the foundation of a new era. Caio, finally exposed, faced the weight of his actions. Because life, in the end, demands precision. Sometimes it takes time, sometimes it hides under disguises. But it always charges. And you, what did you think of this story? Did it impact you in any way? We want to know your opinion, so comment below how you felt about the end of this journey. And of course, if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel now to continue following intense stories like this one. Here, no betrayal is romanticized or justified. Our goal is to show that the truth always finds a way to come out, and that loyalty is the basis of everything. Until next time.